Nobody questioned her coffee order. Nobody questioned the fact that she ate alone every single night, facing the door of the break room with her back to the wall. Nobody questioned the way her eyes swept a room the moment she entered it, cataloging every exit, every potential threat, every person before she had even set down her medical bag. They just figured she was shy. They were wrong. She had been working the night shift at Lejeune Regional Military Medical Center for exactly 7 months. She was assigned to the surgical recovery ward, and in those 7 months, every Marine, every corpsman, every seasoned trauma physician on that floor had reduced her to a single, dismissive label. Rookie. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. And they had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman in the ill-fitting scrubs was the reason they were going to survive it. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, sits in the coastal flatlands between the pine forests and the Atlantic Ocean. The military base is a city unto itself, self-contained and self-sufficient, with its own schools, its own grocery stores, and its own hospital. Lejeune Regional Military Medical Center was not a civilian institution. It was a hardened, security-cleared, no-nonsense facility that treated the men and women of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. Combat wounds, training injuries, the kind of physical damage that civilians rarely saw and rarely survived. The staff matched the building. They were blunt, efficient, and deeply proud. They did not suffer fools, and they did not waste time coddling newcomers, which was why the arrival of Maya Reeves was treated with a particular brand of cold military politeness that was functionally indistinguishable from outright contempt. She showed up on a rainy Monday morning in early October, hauling a single weathered duffel bag and a set of civilian nursing credentials that no one had asked for. She was 29, with olive skin, dark eyes that caught the light in a strange, calculating way, and a face that was entirely too composed for someone walking into a new job for the first time. She was not particularly tall, not particularly imposing. She wore her dark hair in a neat braid that sat precisely between her shoulder blades and moved exactly the same way regardless of how fast she walked. And she walked very fast, not with the nervous, eager shuffle of a new hire, with a flat, purpose-driven efficiency that made the air around her feel slightly pressurized. Lieutenant Commander Raymond Stokes, the head of surgical recovery, watched her cross the floor toward the charge desk on that first morning with his arms folded across his broad chest and one eyebrow cocked at a skeptical angle. Stokes was former Fleet Marine Force, a Navy corpsman who had deployed to Fallujah twice before becoming a physician's assistant, and he ran his ward the way Marines ran a fire team, tight, disciplined, and entirely without sentiment. He looked at her paperwork. Then he looked at her. "Reeves," he said flatly, "you ever worked a military medical facility before?" "No, sir," Maya said, her voice quiet, unremarkable, barely above a conversational murmur. "You come from a civilian hospital?" "Providence Regional in Seattle, sir. 3 years in trauma recovery." Stokes didn't look impressed. He slid her paperwork back across the desk without looking at it. "This isn't a civilian hospital, Reeves. We have patients here who've had their legs blown off. We have patients who wake up screaming and swing at whoever is closest. We have patients who have experienced things that would break most people who have lived comfortable civilian lives." He paused, letting that land. "Do you think you can handle that?" Maya looked at him without blinking. "I'll manage, sir." It was not the enthusiastic reassurance Stokes had been angling for. It was flat, certain, and somehow more unsettling than confidence would have been. "Fine," he said. "Report to Nurse Walsh for orientation. Don't touch anything you haven't been cleared for. And don't get in anyone's way." Maya nodded and walked toward the ward without another word. Stokes watched her go, the unsettled feeling nagging at the back of his skull like a splinter. The ward was populated by people who had earned a right to be difficult. Gunnery Sergeant Terrence Bull Bullock was in bed 7, recovering from reconstructive surgery on a shattered knee sustained during a live fire training exercise. He weighed 240 pounds of pure, irritable muscle and had strong opinions about nurses who knocked too softly on his door, asked too many times how he was feeling, and generally impeded his stated goal of being discharged within a week. "You the new one?" Bull asked, the first time Maya appeared in his doorway to check his drain output. "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant." How long you been a nurse? 3 years post-licensure. Bull looked her up and down with the blunt assessment of a man who evaluated human beings strictly by their operational value. You look like you belong in a pediatric ward, he said. No offense. None taken, Maya said, making a precise notation in his chart without looking up. You ever worked with Marines before? Not in this capacity. Bull narrowed his eyes. There was something in that specific phrasing, in that careful redirection, that didn't sit right. Not in this capacity. What other capacity would a nurse work with Marines? He filed it away and said nothing else. But he watched her. Bull had spent 23 years in the Marine Corps learning to identify the people in a room who were the most dangerous. He had a gift for it, a refined instinct that had saved his life on 3 separate deployments. That instinct was currently firing at a low, persistent frequency every single time Maya Reeves walked into his room. He wasn't afraid of her. He just couldn't figure her out. And Gunnery Sergeant Terrence Bullock did not like things he couldn't figure out. Over the following weeks, the rest of the ward constructed a portrait of Maya Reeves from the fragments she left behind. It was an incomplete picture, all edges and strange gaps. She was technically flawless. Every 4 insertion was perfect on the first attempt, no matter how collapsed the vein. Her wound assessments were thorough to a degree that the attending physicians occasionally found either impressive or mildly embarrassing, depending on their ego. Dr. Caleb Marsh, the chief surgical attending, a former naval medical officer with a chest full of ribbons, once watched her identify the early signs of a developing surgical site infection a full 6 hours before his own morning rounds would have caught it, and spent the rest of that day being slightly short-tempered with everyone. She was also unnervingly situationally aware in a way that had nothing to do with nursing. Corpsman First Class Danny Herrera was the first one to put words to it. He told the story 3 different times over the following week. He had been moving a wheeled medication cart down the hallway when the axle caught on a floor threshold and the heavy steel cart lurched sideways, spilling toward the floor. Standard incident. He braced for the crash. The crash never came. Maya had been walking 12 feet behind him. By the time the cart started falling, she had already covered the distance, caught the upper rail of the cart with both hands, and controlled the descent to a quiet, careful stop. She hadn't run. She hadn't shouted. She had simply reacted before Danny's brain had finished processing the word falling. Danny had stood there, staring at her, holding his breath. You might want to check that axle casing, Maya said pleasantly, straightening the vials that had shifted in their tray. Looks like the wheel housing is cracked. She walked away. Danny stared at the space she had occupied, his skin prickling. That was fast, he said, to no one in particular. But nobody wanted to examine it too carefully. The ward was busy. They had patients to manage. Maya Reeves was quiet, proficient, and unobtrusive. In the grinding machinery of a military medical ward running on too few staff and too many critical patients, those were her defining qualities. Everything else was background noise. They would pay for that lack of attention in exactly 3 weeks. The night before everything changed began the way most nights on the ward began. Quietly, with the particular institutional stillness that falls over a military hospital after 2,200 hours, when the overhead lights dim to their nighttime setting and the hallways fill with nothing but the soft percussion of monitor beeps and the distant rhythm of the duty corpsman's boots on linoleum. Maya was halfway through a double shift. She had covered for a corpsman who had gone home sick, and she had done it without complaint, which nobody had expected and nobody commented on. She sat at the nurse's station writing notes, her handwriting small and extremely precise, and she drank black coffee from a stainless steel thermos she brought from home. Stokes came out of his office at 0140, looking gray around the edges. You should go home, Reeves, he said, dropping a stack of files on the counter. You've been here 18 hours. I'm fine, sir. That's not what I asked. I know, she said, and offered him a small, steady smile that communicated absolutely nothing about what she was actually thinking. Stokes looked at her for a long moment. He had run out of ways to categorize this woman. She was not anxious. She was not particularly warm. She was not performing efficiency for approval, which was what most new staff did. She simply existed in the ward with a quality of dense, quiet competence that he had encountered before, but not here, not in a nurse with 3 years of civilian experience. He had encountered it in operators, in SEALs and Force Recon Marines and MARSOC raiders, men and women who had been distilled by training and combat into something fundamentally different from the people around them. He was about to say something. He wasn't sure what. The instinct was half-formed, an unfinished thought turning over in the back of his mind like an engine trying to catch. Then the power went out. Not a surge, not a flicker. A clean, absolute cut to black that swallowed every light on the floor simultaneously, lasting exactly 4 seconds before the backup generators engaged and the emergency amber lighting bled up from the baseboard strips. Maya was on her feet before the amber light stabilized. She wasn't at the nurse's station anymore. She was at the window at the far end of the hallway, pressing her back flat against the wall beside the frame, peering into the parking lot with 2 fingers parting the blinds. Stokes hadn't even seen her move. He crossed the hallway in 8 rapid strides. Reeves, it's probably just a grid fault. The backup system engaged correctly, Maya said, her voice completely flat. Her eyes were fixed on the parking lot. This wasn't a grid fault. Look at the transformer box at the southwest corner of the lot. Stokes looked. The transformer junction box was a heavy gray steel structure mounted on a concrete pad at the edge of the staff parking area. In the amber and shadow of the emergency lighting, it was barely visible. But the cover panel on its front was hanging open. Not blown open. Open. The way a cover panel looks when someone with tools has removed it deliberately and recently. The cold settled into Stokes' spine. Someone cut the primary feed manually, Maya said. From outside. Before Stokes could respond, Danny Herrera appeared from the corpsman station at the far end of the ward, his face tight. Lieutenant Commander, I just tried to reach base security on the landline. Dead. Cell signal on my phone is gone too. Full jamming. The ward went very, very quiet. Maya turned from the window. Her face was calm in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface with enormous weight and pressure moving underneath. How many patients are critical on this floor right now? She asked Stokes directly, her voice precise and unhurried, as though she were asking about a medication order. 4, Stokes said. 3 post-op, 1 chest wound with a pleural drain. Where's Dr. Marsh? In surgery on the 2nd floor. He's been in the OR since 2100. Who else is on the ward? Night staff. Me, you, Danny, corpsman Price on the south end. 2 orderlies. Stokes looked at her. The question she had asked and the way she had asked it was not how a civilian trauma nurse assessed the situation. Reeves, what do you think is? The stairwell door at the north end of the corridor opened. 4 men came through it. They were not in military uniform. They were dressed in dark civilian tactical gear, plate carriers without insignia, and balaclava masks that covered everything below their eyes. They moved in a tight combat stack, the lead man sweeping left, the second man sweeping right, rifles up and moving. Not raised for intimidation, raised because they intended to use them. The man at point was big, economical, his movements too clean for a criminal and too aggressive for any legitimate security force. He took in the amber-lit ward corridor in a single scan and located the nurse's station immediately. Everyone on the floor, he barked, his voice carrying the flat, controlled authority of someone who issued orders for a living. Hands where I can see them. Anyone reaches for a phone or a radio, they go down. Danny Herrera froze at the far end of the corridor, his hands coming up slowly. Corpsman Price, a 22-year-old from rural Georgia, backed herself against the wall, her face sheet white. Stokes stepped forward from the window, positioning himself between the armed men and the ward doors. This is a military medical facility, he said, his voice steady with a Marine's hardwired refusal to be intimidated. You're pointing weapons at recovering combat veterans. Stand down and identify yourselves. The lead man didn't even slow his stride. He moved past Stokes like he was furniture, gesturing to one of his team who seized Stokes by the arm and shoved him against the counter. We're not here for the patients, the lead man said. He stopped at the nurse's station, scanning the ward board, running his eyes across the room numbers and patient names. We're here for one person. Colonel James Harker. Room 214. Take me there. Stokes's jaw tightened. Colonel Harker was in room 214. He had been admitted 4 days ago for emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from his lung, sustained during a classified training exercise in the mountains of North Carolina. The official incident report was thin and implausible. The unofficial story, which moved through the ward in whispers, was that Harker was carrying intelligence from a joint JSOC operation that had gone catastrophically wrong in Eastern Europe. Intelligence that certain people very much did not want him to deliver to the Congressional Oversight Committee he was scheduled to testify before in 8 days. He had been under discreet watch, not official, not announced, because the people responsible for the threat were the same people who would have handled the official watch. Nobody had thought the threat would reach him here, inside a military hospital on the most heavily secured Marine base on the East Coast. That had been a spectacular failure of imagination. "I'm not taking you anywhere," Stokes said. The lead man turned to look at him with a calm, reptilian patience. "Then we find it ourselves, and anyone who gets in our way gets treated as a hostile." He nodded to his team. 2 of them moved toward the ward corridor. 1 stayed on Stokes, pressing a forearm across his throat. The 4th man positioned himself at the stairwell door. And then the 5th man, who had been covering the southern approach, spoke into his earpiece. "Cruz, I lost the nurse." The lead man, Cruz, stopped. He turned slowly. He looked at the space beside the window where Maya Reeves had been standing 30 seconds ago. The space was empty. "Find her," Cruz said, his voice dropping an octave. Right now, the south utility corridor of Lejeune Regional's 2nd floor was a narrow, poorly lit service passage that ran behind the patient rooms. It housed the oxygen line manifolds, the electrical junction boxes, and the thick bundles of data cabling that connected the ward monitoring systems to the central server room. It smelled like antiseptic and warm metal. Maya moved through it without a flashlight. She didn't need one. She had memorized the exact dimensions of this corridor on her 3rd day at the facility, walking it during a maintenance call she had quietly volunteered for. The distances between junction boxes, the location of the fire suppression system's manual release, the exact weight and swing radius of the steel door at the south end that accessed the ore prep area on the floor above. She paused at a junction box, pressed her ear against the wall, and listened. She could hear them. 2 sets of boots moving with trained precision toward the south end of the ward. They were running room checks, moving efficiently, which told her they had done this kind of thing before and they knew they were on a clock. She assessed everything she had. No weapon. A pair of heavy bandage scissors in her left scrub pocket. A 14-gauge 4-needle in her right. A full 60 milliliters irrigation syringe still clipped to her badge lanyard. A working knowledge of every piece of equipment in every utility closet on this floor. And something else. Something they had no way of accounting for. She opened her mind and put away the civilian part of it. The quiet nurse. The careful professional who took notes in small, precise handwriting and drank her coffee alone and never explained herself to anyone. The lock opened. The cold settled in behind her eyes. That familiar, unnatural stillness that her first SEAL instructor had called the bubble. That meditative operational focus where the noise of emotion and adrenaline dissolved and only the architecture of the problem remained. She had spent 3 years trying to keep that door closed. Tonight it swung wide. She moved. The first man was called Riker. He was 6 feet, 200 pounds, ex-private military, and he was pushing open the door to the linen storage room with his rifle barrel when Maya came out of the utility access hatch in the wall behind him. Not from the door. From a hatch panel, 18 inches square, designed for maintenance access to the oxygen manifold. He didn't hear it open. He didn't hear her land. He heard absolutely nothing until her left forearm was around his throat and her right hand had seized his rifle barrel, pushing it toward the floor and simultaneously rotating the weapon against the natural flex of his wrist. The pain was immediate and catastrophic. The suppression system for this room is an on-site gaseous agent, not water, Maya continued, her voice completely unhurried. Halon substitute, non-toxic at the standard discharge rate. It will drop the visibility in that room to near zero for approximately 45 seconds, disorient anyone inside who isn't expecting it, and trigger the corridor alarm, which will bring the emergency response team from the security post at the south gate. The alarm system runs on the backup generator, Stokes said slowly. Yes, Maya said, which is still running. Stokes looked at the syringe, and then he looked at Maya Reeves, and the last of the walls inside his professional assessment of her came entirely down. I'll cover the door, he said. What happened next took 11 seconds. Maya pulled the false ceiling tile in the corridor, reached the suppression line junction, capped the syringe against the thermal sensor, and pushed the plunger. The alarm screamed. The room door blew open on its pneumatic emergency release, as all coded doors did on a fire alarm activation. Cruz spun, his hand going his weapon. Stokes came through the door, moving fast and low, and Cruz pivoted to track him, which meant Cruz's back was to the door for a fraction of a second. The fraction of a second was enough. Maya was behind him. She drove the hard heel of her palm into the back of his weapon arm at the exact point where the tricep connects to the elbow joint, collapsing it. His rifle spun away. She simultaneously hooked her leg around his forward knee and took his base, and Cruz hit the floor with the concentrated force of someone who had no warning and no leverage. He landed face down, hard, and Maya's knee was in the small of his back before he had finished sliding. She took his weapon, cleared the chamber, and stood up. Cruz rolled his head to one side and stared up at her from the floor. There was blood on his lip from the impact. His eyes, above the pulled-down balaclava, were wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into something much more troubled. "Who are you?" he said, his voice raw. Maya looked down at him with the same expression she used when she was reviewing a particularly unremarkable chart. "I'm a night shift nurse," she said, "and you're bleeding on my patient's floor." The security detail from the south gate arrived at 0203. They found 4 restrained, incapacitated individuals at various points on the second floor. A 5th individual face down on the floor of room 214 with his wrists secured with a compression bandage, and a colonel with a chest drain sitting up in bed looking at the whole scene with a careful, evaluating expression of a man reassessing several prior assumptions. Lieutenant Commander Stokes was holding a confiscated rifle and a very complicated look on his face. Maya was at the nursing station, writing her incident report in small, precise handwriting, her thermos of black coffee beside her, apparently undamaged. The security commander, Master Sergeant Roy Delaney, was a man who had been in the military long enough to recognize the signs of a situation that had been handled before he got there, and he was professional enough to feel only mild irritation about it rather than outright wounded pride. He surveyed the corridor, took in the restrained individuals, noted the absence of any casualties among the hospital staff, and walked to the nursing station. "Ma'am," he said, with the careful, flat courtesy of someone maintaining composure under difficult conditions. "Can you walk me through what happened here?" "I can," Maya said, without looking up from her report. "It'll be in the documentation. I prefer the verbal version first." She looked up. Those dark, level eyes found his. 5-person entry team cut the primary power at the transformer junction and jammed cellular frequencies. They entered via the north stairwell. Their objective was Colonel Harker in room 214. I neutralized 4 of the 5 operatives in the corridor, and Lieutenant Commander Stokes handled the 5th in the room. No patients were harmed. Total elapsed time from breach to containment was approximately 8 minutes. Delaney looked at her for a long time. "You neutralized 4 trained tactical operators," he said slowly, "in 8 minutes while unarmed in a hospital corridor." "I had bandage scissors," Maya said, "and an irrigation syringe." Delaney looked at Stokes. Stokes spread his hands. "I watched most of it. I genuinely don't have anything useful to add." From room 214, Colonel Harker's voice carried into the corridor, still strong despite the drain tubes and the pale, drawn exhaustion of a man 4 days out of emergency thoracic surgery. "Give me the base commander on a secure line," Harker said, "and someone get that nurse in here. I want to talk to her." The base commander arrived at 0245. His name was Brigadier General Paul Renwick, and he arrived in his uniform, which meant he had been dressed when the call came, which meant he had not been sleeping, which meant he already knew something had been coming tonight, even if he hadn't known when or how. He came into the corridor and looked at the restrained operatives, and then he looked at Maya Reeves, and the expression that crossed his face was not surprise. It was recognition. He dismissed the security detail. He dismissed Delaney. He gave Stokes and the corpsman a look that communicated, without words and without ambiguity, that they were not dismissed, but that they should find somewhere else to be for the next 15 minutes. He walked to the nursing station and stood across the counter from Maya. "You should have called me," he said. "Not an accusation. A statement." "I didn't have a secure channel," Maya said. "You could have come to me directly when Harker was admitted. You knew what he was carrying." "I didn't know it would move this fast," Maya said quietly. "And I didn't know who to trust inside the facility. The same people who ordered the hit had access to the base security roster." Renwick was quiet for a moment. "Your cover is blown." "Yes, sir. The unit is going to have to move you." "I know." Renwick looked at her, a long, searching look, the kind of look that a man gives when he is trying to reconcile two completely different images of the same person. 7 months, he said. "You worked this ward for 7 months. Stokes had no idea. Harker's protection detail had no idea. The people I put on that roster had no idea." "That was the point," Maya said. "Stokes got a commendation he was not allowed to publicly display. Danny Herrera told the story for the rest of his career, at every base he was ever assigned to, always slightly embarrassed by how little he had done compared to the quiet woman standing behind him. Bull Bullock was discharged 11 days later, 2 ahead of schedule, because the surgical team agreed there was nothing left to monitor. His knee was as good as the engineering of it could make it. He walked out of the hospital under his own power, the way he had intended to. The duffel bag with the stainless steel thermos in it. It was sitting on the chair in the nurse's break room, the corner chair facing the door. Danny found it the morning after she left. There was a single sheet of paper folded under it. Not a note, not an explanation, just a 7-digit number and 2 lines, written in small, precise handwriting. For the ward emergency supply fund. Use it for whatever the patients need most. Danny looked at the number. It was a bank transfer confirmation from an account with no name attached. He looked at the empty chair for a long time. Outside the window, a North Carolina morning was building toward noon. The ward was running, humming, breathing. Monitors beeped. Corpsmen moved with practiced efficiency down the corridor. Somewhere in the building, a surgeon was already in the OR, saving someone's life with the blunt, brilliant tools of medicine. The chair in the corner stayed empty for a long time. Nobody sat in it, not by any explicit agreement, but by a quiet, unspoken consensus. It was her chair. It would always be her chair. And occasionally on the difficult nights when a code called and a patient teetered on the edge and the monitors screamed and the staff poured everything they had into pushing someone back from the darkness, Lieutenant Commander Stokes would look up from the bedside for a single, involuntary second. He was never sure what he was looking for. He was always sure he didn't find it. But the code would break. The patient would stabilize. The monitor would settle into its steady, rhythmic, merciful beeping, and the ward would exhale. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Raymond Stokes would file it under the same category as the empty chair and the precise handwriting and the 8 minutes he had witnessed and would never entirely be able to explain. Some people do not leave footprints. They just leave the living behind. If this story had you gripping the edge of your seat from the first line to the last, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share this with someone who deserves to read it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight all around us. They are everywhere, and you will never see them coming.